from here, we're going to talk about finding the right leverage point in terms of talking about sustainability issues. What we would like to do this morning, we have about an hour. I'd like Professor Spence to kick us off, but be as brief as possible. And the other three gentlemen, we have agreed that we would be brief and succinct, because what we'd like to do is to have a chance to actually engage with you. So, Professor Spence, can I have you go first?
I'll be very brief. I think you've heard enough from me. One, I think Asia is a high leverage point because for the large countries in Asia, particularly China and India, but for the region as a whole, because of the scale of the growth that's coming, what is in most of the rest of the world and most small places a global issue where they don't really have that big an effect, here, it's a long-term growth strategy issue. So I believe, and I am willing to back it up with spending a fair amount of time on this here, is I think this is the place where this is going to get taken seriously, and I wouldn't be very surprised if Asia turns out to be in an important leadership position in the next few years in moving various aspects of the sustainability agenda forward. So that's kind of point one. Point two, Pamela and I have worked on this with Nick. I think we're right to define this broadly. I suspect we'll focus on the terribly important natural resource dimension of it, but I would like to say one thing. If we don't get better at identifying destructive, defective growth models that either end in a crisis or screech to a halt and cause considerable distress, and if we don't get good at dealing with the important, equity-related issues, unemployment of the young, very badly deteriorating income distribution situations, a clear global pattern of declining fractions of national income going to labor, then we won't get to the other agenda because it's long-term, and the political systems and the policymakers will either be dealing with crises or dealing with political dysfunction or dealing with deteriorating social cohesion. So I think we have to put it all together in a package and deal with it simultaneously. It may make it more complicated, it may make it a little more confusing, but the honest truth is these are all legitimate dimensions of sustainability. And the last thing, Christine, I think I'd like to say before I subside and listen to people of real insight, including you, who I hope you will speak about your own experiences, is that as I've tried to delve into this and understand it, the challenges appear awfully daunting if you look out 50 years. Take seriously the sort of scientific input on carbon, on water, on all kinds of things. But I don't think that's the right way to think of it. We're going on a sort of 40 to 50-year journey together. And I think what I've seen is that groups, individuals, organizations have sort of said, look, we don't know how to get to the 50-year endpoint. That's not a good definition of the problem right now. Let's do what we can. Let's find ways to organize, motivate, and so on. And I think that's working. It's messy. I think that using up the time of thousands of people negotiating on whether you can get binding agreements to 50-year targets on carbon emissions is just craziness. I mean, nobody in their right mind, given the amount we know, would make such a commitment. And if a political leader made it, they'd be out of office the next week. So I think we're going in the right direction. That is, the people who've taken control of this agenda are people on the ground, small organizations, and I'm kind of getting optimistic about it. So that's what I wanted to say by way of introduction and how we hope to go about it. Over to you.
This is an excellent place to come to you, Chen Yi, because you're deep in the knowledge of climate change, and obviously that's a big issue for Asia, a big issue for China, and Professor Spence has just in a way provoked us into saying, Rio +20, which is happening in a couple of weeks, all the climate negotiations, all the COP meetings, COP 18 at Qatar later on this year, boy, if we did away with all of that, maybe it won't hurt too much. So what's your view?
Well, I basically agree with everything Professor Spence just talked about, particularly, and I agree with this first point is this changing this defect, what Professor Spence called the defective development model is really a critical element for sustainability of everything else. And I also agree that China has a very important role to play in all this equation, and China has opportunity in participating and defining the Asia's role in this regard. That being said, I now also relate to what we have heard yesterday from Chairman Liu Mingkang when he was talking about the 12th five-year plan, talking about the environment, the environmental agenda there. Now, I have to, I wish I could share his sense of optimism there. And unfortunately, I do see these daunting challenges for the 12th five-year plan to meet this target of the 16% cut energy intensity and 17% cut in carbon intensity. I said that I do not look at the 50-year time frame, but look at the 5-year time frame. When you look at the 11th five-year plan, probably China has the best opportunity to meet these kind of targets in the 11th five-year plan. But when you look ever since the 2008, ever since 2009, actually, when this 4 trillion RMB, the stimulus package was put there, we have never been able to achieve a target greater than 3.6% cut in energy intensity. Last year, 2011, is the first year of the 12th five-year plan. And according to the plan, we're supposed to cut 3.6%. In fact, what we have achieved, what China has achieved, is only 2%. There are, of course, many reasons why we cannot really deliver what we plan to do. The number one being the development right now. When you look at local government, provincial, municipal, and the county governments, they are just way above the GDP target. Many of them more than doubled. So I think that there's a huge investment over there in the local levels is going to be a really, really important factor to figure out whether or not we can achieve this environmental sustainability target for the 12th five-year plan. So I myself, in general, I am an optimistic person, but for this particular issue, I'm quite pessimistic. Right.
I know kind of how you feel. You know, there's some people who would want to criticize your view, would say, well, you know, this is moving the deck chair on the Titanic. And my answer has always been, if I was on the Titanic, and if it was my job to move chairs, I'd probably still go ahead and do it. And if I was still not yet on collision course with the iceberg, then of course I'd still want to move the deck chairs. So I'm kind of in your school. And maybe part of the problem is we have, all of us are very optimistic people, and we believe in still continuing to do things. But I'd like to introduce the other two speakers, Andrew Brandler of CLP and Andy Tung of OOCL. Now, perhaps I can go to Andrew first, only because you're in the energy sector, and energy is just so important. And a lot of the discussion today in Asia about our growth, even about equity, you know, how poor people can at least turn the light bulb on, that is just so important. So perhaps you can share some perspective with us.
Happy to, Christine. I think to pick up on the Titanic analogy, which has been sort of heavily played in the last couple of days, as well as since the centenary anniversary of the accident. I think of myself as the captain on the Titanic, and we're steaming across the Atlantic, and we sort of know there are risks out there. And you know, my job as a chief executive of what is a pretty large company is to focus not only on the growth of the business, but also risk management. And we've been in business over 100 years. We want to be in business for the next 100 years, and I agree with Mike, you can't look too far ahead. You know, you can't say, well, but we have a a clearly defined what we call sustainability framework that's looking at where our businesses are likely to be in 20 years' time, and what do we need to do to get there? What are the decisions we have to make today across the whole spectrum of sustainability? And we define it much more broadly than environment. Obviously, environment is very important given the nature of our business, and particularly climate change, because we operate in Asia, which is a part of the world that is heavily focused on coal-fired generation, very high carbon emissions. We know that's not sustainable. And we've set a very clear path how we're going to decarbonize our portfolio over the next 20, 30 years. But obviously, we can't do that in isolation from policy levers that come from the mainland or India or Southeast Asia or wherever else that we're operating. So for us, sustainability is absolutely about risk management. That sounds a bit sort of technical and a bit sort of cynical, as it were, but that's, to my mind, that's the right way to look at it. We want to be in business in the future. What decisions do we need to make today to ensure that we are in business in 20, 30 years' time? As I say, it's more than just climate change. That's an important factor, but we are looking across the whole spectrum. Our sustainability framework picks up employees. What do we need to do to motivate our employees? Our customers, what's going to be important? We have a franchise from society. We have 2 million customer accounts here. We have 3 million customer accounts in Australia. Our license to operate will depend upon how they perceive how we're reacting to these issues. So customers, very important, the wider stakeholders, et cetera. So we set up a very clear framework that all our businesses need to articulate in their business plans how they're going to address a whole bunch of criteria we're set. And I must admit, we're still sort of feeling our way forward there. It's difficult for businesses that are, frankly, more focused on the short term to step back a little bit and say, well, what are some of the longer-term decisions do we need to make? But we're starting down that path. We're going to, like the postage stamp analogy, we're going to stick to that. We're going to stick on that letter and keep at it. And we recognize that the external circumstances will change, policies will change, government positions will change, climate change discussions will ebb and flow, and we have to be cognizant of that. We're in business to make money for the long term and create value for the long term for our shareholders. So we need to recognize environment will change. But I think we've got a pretty good starting point, pretty clear framework, sense of cohesion within the company, what we're trying to do over the longer term, and we'll see how we progress down that journey.
Well, perhaps I can ask you just to think about a question which I would like to come back to, which is, where you think you are, and if indeed you are the captain of the Titanic, do you make an assumption that the ship can't sink? Because that's what we've been told.
Well, we know there are icebergs out there. I think we know that. But is the design such that we can't sink? That's a very good question.
So I think just give it a little bit of thought, but perhaps we can ask Andy to talk a little bit about what is the leverage point? And this is a question I want to come back to each one of the three previous speakers, because we want to hear from you also the situation that you clearly assess and articulate today, and because we want to go away feeling somewhat optimistic. What's the leverage point that you're seeing today? However small it may be, share with us that leverage point, and then we can talk a little bit about how we can build on that leverage point. So but before that, Andy.
Okay. Well, Christine, I heard several comments here, how things are challenging. There's some pessimistic views, some optimistic views. But I also heard, Professor Spence talk about sort of, people on the ground doing it. And I just want to kind of share an example, really, of what's taking place in our industry, particularly in Hong Kong. You may or may not be aware of, there was something called the Fair Wind Charter. This was an agreement that was a voluntary agreement that was put together by the industry association. I'm from OCL's in the container shipping sector, and so a number of shipping lines that are operating container ships in Hong Kong, working very closely with Christine and the Pacific Exchange. We came up with a voluntary scheme, and the scheme involves the reduction of emissions in the form of cutting down sort of a sulfur content emissions on a voluntary basis for a period of time. And in that exercise, we also, in the charter, we also call for the government actually to provide more guidance and legislation, as well as play a role in coordinating the efforts across the border with the Pearl River Delta. And also think about providing incentives. And I think here's an example where actually I would argue it's probably in the scheme of things a small thing, but I would argue that it's been a positive move, seeing industry participants come together and also government playing a role and taking a very proactive step. And I think in a sort of small positive way, it's a very positive development where we've seen participants voluntarily burn cleaner fuel, and the incentive package that the government has introduced and is still being worked on, and legislation also being introduced and being worked on. So I think it's a very, it's a nice example of how, in a relatively small scale, we're able to get together and make some progress.
But perhaps I can just fill you in a little bit on this extraordinary effort that the shipping community has really come together to do. It's little known in Hong Kong because nobody has complained about it. It's one of those projects where I think everybody is happy and everybody is involved. And if you were there and you heard my comment about the engagement side of bringing people together, it took about 3 years to bring the shipping sector, and this actually also includes the people who run ports, the people, even the small ships. But the big ship owners, the ship liners, and the ship owners stepped forward, and basically after 3 years of discussion and understanding what the issues are, to say that they would voluntarily use their own funds, that when the ships come into Hong Kong, when the ship berths, that they would switch to a cleaner fuel. And they worked out that this was going to cost them, and I think it was in 2010 when this initial conversation took place, and the bigger shipping companies worked out it would cost them about $1 million a year. And these are the bigger ships that has more ships coming in. It would cost them $1 million a year to switch fuels. And I think at that time, the shipping market was quite strong, and the big players were willing to do it. So as soon as somebody put their hand up and said, I'm willing to do this, it carried a number of people along. So the most important thing that I found about this was because the shipping industry came along, they went to government and they said, we're willing to do this. The government said, wow, we've never been asked by business that they want to be regulated. In fact, they said, well, we can't keep doing this voluntarily because it means that the good boys who are paying that extra $1 million a year would lose money, and the bad boys who don't sign up, well, they'll get a benefit. So, and then people on the other side of the border actually the local Hong Kong officials, they questioned also that if in Hong Kong they were to regulate, that means if a ship came in, everybody had to switch to a cleaner fuel, whether that would disadvantage Hong Kong. Maybe all the ships would go to Shenzhen. And I think it took the experience of the shipping companies to say, well, actually, that really isn't going to happen. But it took a while for government to feel comfortable with that. And where we are today is the government has actually come up with a subsidy to help. I think the shipping company would like a bit more generous subsidy. But in any case, there is a subsidy on the table for 3 years. And conversation has already started with Beijing, with Shenzhen, and with Guangdong to turn the whole of the Pearl River Delta water into a controlled zone. So whilst I think, Andy, you say it's small, but the potential is very big. So the most important thing is the actors, the people who have to do this, which is the shipping company and government, they've actually stepped forward and are working very hard on it. But maybe I can go back to the question of the Titanic. Perhaps Professor Spence, just one more general comment from you.
No, I think what you're talking about is actually very important. And if there's two kinds of effects that you get from a successful effort like this. One is that you can scale it up. And two, you get a demonstration effect. What process whereby business takes initiative along with a civil society organization and then goes to government and tells them what they need to do to support it. I mean, this whole area is just shot through with what economists call coordination problems. In the business context, it means, you know, it's the disadvantage of being the first mover. And there's lots of, we got to learn how to do this, bottom line. I mean, take America. A bunch of people get together, you know, and start talking about this. The first thing you know, there's some smart lawyer will come along with the antitrust law and say, what are you guys talking about? Well, you know, we've got to get that barrier out of the way. People have to talk about this. And you see this problem at multiple levels, including internationally. So the German industrialists are sort of outraged that their government's out front, you know, on sort of climate change things because, frankly, you know, if you get too far out front, it's a disadvantage. So I think a high leverage point is some version of a successful program like this scaled up with a lot of learning that can be shared in another context. And the way I think this is going to go is business is going to generate the motivation and the forward momentum, and then we're going to learn how to go tell government how to support it. Now, some of it's really important. In Andrew's world, you know, some of the alternative technologies are going to be rational only if we get the pricing of energy and carbon right, I think. And maybe we're a little bit away from that. But well, that's where I think the high leverage is.
Well, and you know, there must be some leverage point on mainland China. And then I think on energy, and we were talking about Hong Kong, and I assume most of the people sitting here are living in Hong Kong. You know, this whole thing in Hong Kong about energy prices, you know, tariffs, that's the political sensitive point. But in terms of what opportunities there are for our two utilities, and some may say three if we throw in town gas, what are some of the things that could be done which opens up the market? You know, it might change. It might change how the energy sector is being regulated. I won't ask you to comment immediately, Andrew, because I know these are all very serious areas. But before I ask any of you to speak again, I'd like to just ask people in the audience, share with us some perspective or some questions that you have. 1, 2. The lady in front, please. Yes.
From the Fung Global Institute. I'm looking at the title of the session, which is Sustainable Growth in Asia, Finding the Right Leverage Points. And I would just like to raise the question about technology, because in many industries and situations, a new technology comes along and is such an important leverage point that it changed the game. And I have not heard anyone really address any of the potential technology that could change that in terms of sustainable growth. And I'm thinking in particular of fossil fuel, not because it's sustainable, but because we've heard for so long that there will be a shortage of fuel one day, you know, the peak theory. And then new technologies come along where more oil and gas are discovered, where fracturing is used, where gas can be liquefied, solidified. And then all of a sudden, we're saying there shouldn't be any problem with the supply of such fuel. So I'm just wondering whether any panel members, or indeed any member of the audience, have a view on whether there are breakthrough technologies that could help to ensure sustainable growth in Asia.
Some people would argue fracking is a new technology, but anyway, can I take also the comment or the question at the back?
Tim Detells from TPG. And I think this is a great, I just want to tie together a few comments and maybe suggest just a thought. And I've done a fair bit of work on the environmental side with Climate Works and Nature Conservancy on the park side, and particularly in China. And I think as you look at the multilateral discussions, as Professor Spence pointed out, it's a prisoner's dilemma, and I'm not very hopeful on those aspects. And I think that businesses will continue to do their thing, as Andy talked about. But at the end of the day, these are just gumdrops. And you have to attack the large slice of the pie. And there's only one place, maybe in the world, certainly in Asia, that's going to matter where you're going to get anything done, and it's China. And it can happen because they have enormous resources, because they understand the issues, they're good thinkers, they have a governmental system that will allow it to happen, which will never happen in India or most other markets in Asia, and they have a ability to be able to execute against goals in a very focused way. So I would, and the scale of, you know, when you add up the numbers at 5,000 GDP per capita, as Dr. Spence pointed out yesterday, and growing, the scale and the rate of change is so dramatic that if you get that right, you know, you have a hope, and things will draft in behind it, probably for the global environment. And if we don't get that right, you can forget it. So, you know, I think if I were in your shoes, I would be trying to influence policy in China. You know, we talked about earlier about the Fung Global Institute, you know, Brookings, which, you know, is a arm of the Democratic Party in the United States, but at least it influences policy, is that you have an opportunity, given Hong Kong's position, given the business relationships you have, and the, you know, very fine intellectual capital that you're putting together, to influence policy and possibly have businesses draft in behind that as supporting actors. And if I were going to focus on one thing, that's all I'd focus on, because I don't think anything else matters.
Any other comments? Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Annie Chen. I'd just like to offer a different perspective. We had talked about the importance of bringing private business into this discussion. And I want to postulate that maybe what we should also consider doing is to articulate values of a global citizenry. I know it's very difficult to talk about values because, you know, particularly for business people and policymakers, you know, they think that it introduces, you know, fuzziness. You know, how do you decide, you know, what to value more? But I would argue that, you know, given the enormous challenges that we all as citizens of this planet face, that there has to be some fundamental values, whether you call it ethical or whatever, that should be driving this. And I think that's what gives people motivation to actually become change agents, you know, wherever they are, whether it's in a company or in government or wherever it is that you work. I actually call myself an optimistic pessimist because I guess in a way I don't know where I sit. But I would also offer that there's we're talking about leverage points, and I would like to offer one possible leverage point which bridges business and values, and that's family businesses. I think that, you know, for family businesses, where even if they're a public company, where the family identity actually is very much wrapped up in the reputation of the business and the direction that it's going, if these individuals actually embody these important values that we can articulate as important to take us towards the goal of a sustainable planet, and to and not be fearful about using these values to help them make decisions, and even better yet is to align the business case with these values. I think that's one way of encouraging private capital to be moving in the right direction. Thank you.
Any other comments at this stage? Yes.
So this is Julian from Dialogue in the Dark. We had operations in China which was providing experiential trainings for business leaders. But through my years of working with the leaders from within China, we realized that we sensed a kind of weakness or vulnerability expressed by our clients, that they may have personal individual choices over cutting their own expenses or live a more environmentally friendly life, or choose not to spend that much. But once they are in their job, and it's inevitably that they have no choice. They have to do their best to lead their business to create consumption. So that's also what the textbooks so far we got from our education about economy and business, especially about business. The nature so far is profit, then it leads to how to create consumption. So I just would like to know from the panelists today, or especially Michael, would there be some other nature, maybe for our next generation, when they read textbooks about business, there be some other nature appear for business, or what will be that? Can we imagine that?
Yeah.
Well, maybe we can take the first point about China first. China itself is a leverage point.
Yep.
And you just shared with us, in a way, your optimism, pessimism as well. 12 five-year plan, you fear that we won't meet the national targets. Maybe you can share with us something about how you see China itself as a leverage point.
Oh, probably I can just follow Tim, the comments. What I see, the problem, where the pessimism comes from are two. One is we're still in some way dealing with the aftermath of the stimulus package in 2009 and afterward. It was, people have different views to look at it. My view of looking at it from this environment sustainability, and it has been a tremendous challenge in meeting the target for cutting the energy use, energy intensity, and the carbon intensity. And that we know was the panic, part of that panic response to the global financial crisis. And right now, I see we're having another panic response to the economic slowdown. When you look at the NDRC, the National Development and Reform Commission, they are approving the investment, the projects that's at like a few times faster than in the past. So these putting together is really put tremendous pressure on sustainable development. However, there is an opportunity. This opportunity that I would see, Barbara just talked about, technology. When you look at the investment, there are different kind of investment. You can invest the money into highly resource consumption and highly polluting industry, but you can also invest the money into different areas. In the 11th five-year plan, on average, every year China invests about $50 billion US on renewable energy, and about half of that, $25 billion, on energy efficiency. The 12th five-year plan, as we see last week, the plan for the new strategic industry just came out. So these are opportunities. These are the leverage point that I see for a better investment. However, even you just multiply by a factor of 5, or still that cannot really balance the kind of investment we see now from the local government. The gentleman over there raised very interesting points, which is when you look at the local, we tend to blame the local governments. We tend to blame the industry for pollution, for other things. But really, the local government, they are in a very difficult situation many times, that they have to produce the GDP, they have to perform well economically, and they have, therefore, to generate the consumption. So I see there is kind of a vicious cycle over there. So I see the opportunity now. Probably the biggest opportunity now is to invest in this clean development, green economy. Christine, you just talked about the Rio Plus 20 green economy being the hot topic for this conference. And for this one, we're having now defining a new economy. So that probably it has to be the biggest part the new economy. And Professor Spence earlier talked about the inclusive growth, inclusive development that has to be part of this new economy. So I see that clearly should be the important leverage points, but I do not really know how, particularly for the next 4 years, the 12th five-year plan, how we can actually turn these opportunities into reality. So I do agree. It's this implementation issue. This is also a design issue. Right?
Well, I think we've come to a way in terms of how we see growth in your business, and this is relevant particularly to, I think, both Andy and to Andrew. Andrew, your business is based on people using more electricity. And yes, you can provide it cleaner. You're going to have to invest in perhaps more expensive technology. I mean, this issue about technology, about consumption, do you have a view in terms of how your business is going to go where you can substantially reduce your environmental impact? And how does it deal with people's sort of consumption pattern? And I think for the shipping industry, again, you do well by either perhaps cutting your costs, but actually for people to ship more boxes. And the boxes that are being shipped is all the stuff that we all want to consume. So I think your question is really about how do we cut back on our way of life, which is not easy. I think business people and I think even politicians, and that's perhaps one of the reasons why when the economy is weak, government says, let's pump in more money, let's pour more concrete. That's the easiest way of doing it, and more subsidies, and therefore we're going back into the vicious cycle. And I think you've all thought about this, but share your soul with us. Andrew.
I'm happy to bare my soul. If I pick up on, I'll sort of get around to sort of answer your question, but let me talk about technology first of all. And in the power generation industry, the technology exists today to massively decarbonize power generation. It exists today, whether it's renewable energy, nuclear, or carbon capture and sequestration for coal-fired generation. The technology exists today. The problem is, as Michael mentioned, is cost. It's the externalities of the impact of carbon emissions in the environment are not priced in at all. And I think politically that's going to be a very, very difficult issue to deal with. And if you look at the last 100 years, I think we tend not to sort of realize it, that the world has benefited enormously from cheap and abundant energy. 200 years ago it didn't exist. Really the last 100 years, it's been a phenomenal benefit to development, cheap and abundant energy. Now the industry can certainly decarbonize it. So as I say, we have a pathway to do that, but it's over a long period of time. And if everybody does what we do, I think we'll get there. But the question is, will everybody do that? And the challenge is simply cost. You're talking about if you move down the path of more renewable energy, and even with technological improvements, which will come, it's still going to be a lot more expensive than cost today. Carbon capture and sequestration, a very expensive technology. Nuclear is one thing that is, and I think in terms of if you're serious about climate change, I think you've got to be serious about nuclear. I know that's a very sensitive issue here in Hong Kong. But as far as the mainland is concerned, it's very clear it's going to push ahead with its nuclear program. But even then, with a pretty aggressive expansion of nuclear by 2020, it'll only represent 4 or 5% of electricity production. So it's a real challenge. And I think when I sit here and I look ahead over the next 20, 30 years, what's the generation mix going to look like in Asia, particularly in China and India, compared to today? I don't think it's going to be very different, frankly, because I think for reasons of affordability, energy security, and so on, coal is still going to be the fuel of choice for the next several decades in Asia. And I don't see it being politically or economically feasible to make the sacrifices that will be necessary to bring in these more expensive technologies anytime soon. I think you're right. China's investing a lot in renewable energy. The numbers sound big, but in terms of how much is invested in fossil fuel, it's tiny. It's going to push ahead on nuclear, and I think over the next 20 years, China will represent something like 80% of the world's incremental nuclear capacity. So China's going to build massively, but even then, it's a drop in the ocean. So I think we're going to have to recognize that Asia's going to live with coal-fired generation, essentially on the same model as we have today. Efficient modern coal-fired power stations, but they're very high carbon. They emit a lot of carbon. There's nothing much you can do about that until you bring in these more expensive technologies. So I'm a little bit, I think that I'm not sure if they're really, as we sit today, very clear leverage points in the next couple of decades to radically change carbon emissions from power generation in Asia. I really don't see an obvious pathway.
Shale gas?
Shale gas may come in, but yeah, that's possible. And clearly that's been a game changer in the United States. But don't forget, gas is still pretty carbon intensive, not as carbon intensive as coal, but it's about half the level of carbon intensity. So gas as a transition to sort of a future world of nuclear and renewables is a possibility, but you still got to get through that transition, which I think is going to be a significant period of time. Yep. I'd just like to make a final comment about the comment the lady made about values, which I think is an important point and family-owned businesses. When I look at the flexibility that I have as a chief executive of essentially a very large but still family-controlled company, and I think that applies for many businesses in Asia. I have the luxury of making some longer-term decisions. In fact, our chairman doesn't want to know about profits in next quarter or next 12 months. He's looking ahead 50 years. His family's been, the Dori family's controlled China Light for nearly 100 years now. And as far as he's concerned, he wants it to be another 100 years. So I've got that flexibility, which comes from long-term thinking and a strong sense of sort of ethical values, which I think is a strong underpinning so you can start to make these longer-term decisions, which do sacrifice in the short term, for sure.
Andy, another strong family company with strong values.
Well, let me just also touch on this technology point as well. And similarly, in our industry, there are, for example, LNG-propelled ships. The issue there right now is that in terms of the size and scale that such technology can support, it's basically running on smaller size ferries in the Baltic Sea, for example. So I think there is ongoing work about how can we use different technologies to further cut down on the amount of power that's required to actually move a ship forward. There's quite a lot of that going on, and hopefully in the next sort of 5-10 years, I think there is certainly enhanced awareness and concern about the importance of cutting down on fuel consumption. Right now, we're in a situation where there's actually quite a natural alignment between sort of the environmental goals and our cost goals, because fuel price is so high. We have a huge incentive to try and keep the fuel consumption down. So we're in a situation right now where the incentives are kind of aligned. I would just make a slightly maybe different point of view. We also, similar to what Andrew talked about, we have the cost issue of using the higher quality fuel or cutting using higher quality fuel, for example. But the cost issue aside, we have an issue of we're always trying to find a level playing field. So we're in a very, very competitive industry, and so the issue is I think the industry generally can handle a lot of these types of increases, provided this can be done across the entire industry, so that everyone is subject to sort of similar treatment. Not that it's easy to do. Our industry is quite an efficient market. Supply and demand really drives the pricing. There's going to be times where we cannot pass on the increases. But at the end of the day, we're really very much focused on having that level playing field. Without that level playing field, it becomes very, very messy, and it's the prisoner's dilemma issue. In our case, also, there's a technical issue. And I guess the easiest way to boil down this, to describe this is, imagine if there's a different emissions and fuel and safety standard. You have a car, right? There's a different standard in Wanchai and Central. You just can't, you need that sort of consistency so that your car can move between all the different jurisdictions. In our industry, every single piece of business that we do is multiple jurisdictions because it's international trade related. As it relates to the point about sort of family businesses, I certainly agree. I think we in Asia here have a little bit more of the luxury, if you will, of maybe a little bit less focus on sort of the result of the next quarter. And so we do have, I think, the ability to look a little bit farther forward. And I think this will be helpful as we all sort of learn about the issues and as we start to think about, how we adapt these considerations into our business planning going forward. Just one more point I wanted to touch on. Obviously, Mr. Feng and Li and Feng, they're about the global supply chain. It's about globalization, and certainly our industry benefits, really lives off of this globalization. And here is the dilemma. So, for example, by having goods made in all different parts of the world and having to be moved from producing areas to consuming areas, it requires energy, to actually do this. And so there is a little bit of a dilemma here where, will people start asking, well, in order to, reduce some of this energy intensity, would we want to manufacture somewhere closer by, for example? And that really flies in the face of, this whole concept of globalization. I think I'm still of the belief that net, that the benefits, the comparative advantage, benefits are certainly there. But I think we then need to really put our heads together and think about, how do we mitigate some of the negative effects from it.
Other comments and questions? Last chance. Chandran, I'm going to call on you. You're sitting there very quiet. Chandran Nair, I think you all know, he's written the book Consumptionnomics. Shake us up a bit. I mean, if you were the captain on the ship, would you know that we're just hurtling down towards this iceberg?
How many minutes have I got?
Make it brief. 2 minutes, how about
but
that?
very, very quickly. I find it interesting that most of these conversations start with whether you have to be optimistic or pessimistic, because we've all bought into a narrative that we want to go away feeling good. I think this is not the subject. I go away feeling very depressed when we have intellectual dishonesty, which is in most platforms, but I will make a judgment on this one. I think fundamentally, I'll just say three things. The suggestion that Asia, much of the discussion about technology is rooted around we can live like the West. Therefore, let's get technology and we'll get this from the West. I think this is a lie. I think the suggestion that 5 billion, 6 billion Asians in 2050 can live like Americans is the height of irresponsibility. This cannot work out. So then we fudge the discussions around technological solutions, free markets, etc. So that's the first point. The second one is to suggest that businesses can be at the forefront of sustainability is also a lie. That is not to suggest that businesses aren't important and have a role, but the core of sustainability, to distill it down to the basics, is the notion of less. Businesses don't do less, they do more. They want to sell more toys, okay? Whether I call it the voodoo economics of buy one, get one free, right? So that's also a lie. So businesses don't provide public good, only the state. So ultimately, I think in Asia, and 2 minutes, we need to reject the notion of economic growth developed around the exceptionalism of the Western model of the 2-3 centuries. Being intellectually subservient, of course, we don't know better. I've been surprised at how many Harvard graduates I've met, all from Asia, in the last 24 hours. So in the intellectual subservience, therefore, doesn't create a new narrative. The new narrative, therefore, is how do we live within limits, which flies in the face of the liberal Western capitalist model. So my point is, the challenge for Asia will be, and I think one person made the point, China will have a better chance because it has a strong state. India has less of a chance because it has a democratic state. But in the West, which country do they love better? The Indians. And therein lies the issue of, therefore, rights, who can have what, because we can't have everything. But you can't go to the Americans and say you can't own a car because it's not a human right. When I do this in the US, they think I'm Taliban undercover. But can anyone imagine that Asians can own cars like the average Europeans? No chance. We will have to intervene. And the fiction that we can have green cars needs to be demolished. So you asked me to intervene, that's my...
Yes.
This is a lie.
Well, I did want you to intervene because I think you all know what Chandran is saying, and it is the tough question. My own sense, and I'd be interested to hear whether you agree or not, is at the political end, and even in China today, even with the strong state and the 12 five-year plan, I think Chinese leaders are still hesitant to propose a different social contract and vision that is based on less means more. And if we were to take it just back down to Hong Kong ourselves, can you imagine the uproar in the public if, and we have a new government, and the new government is going to say, look, you know, we don't need to pour that much concrete. In fact, we could have a great quality of life. We could clean up by doing something quite different. And how will leaders be able to put that message forward? And then I think, yes, for business leaders, how do we have business leaders propose business models where less becomes more? And then the really challenging things is to say, well, even if we know and we have a vision to do that, then how do we move the pricing forward where we can give a chance to businesses transforming themselves? And if I may just come to the electricity sector, which I'm quite familiar with, if we were to say to the people of Hong Kong that actually what we want is for you all to use less energy, so for us to really make the energy companies serious about transforming themselves, then we're going to pay them whenever they do well in cutting back on electricity consumption. So in a way, you're asking people to pay for what they don't use. So as a conceptual leap, do we think we can do that in Hong Kong, which is a very wealthy, very well-educated, very sophisticated society? Question mark, right? Question mark. So I see a hand. Is that a hand? Yes, yes. Please, please.
Just as a continuation of Mr. Chandra's note, I always find it very disturbing when people talk about aging population and needing a certain percentage of minimal population growth, like 1.5, whatever, in order to sustain the current labor force. I think all these problems that we have been talking about on sustainability is basically because there are far too many human beings on Earth. We create our own problem, and we have only so much resources, and it is a finite amount of resources on Earth. So what do we do with it? So I think we should get used to the idea of negative population growth, which is not entirely a bad thing. Of course, economists will tell us that, well, we are short of labor. But if you extend, retirement age, if you free up, women into the workforce in a lot of societies, and yesterday we also talked about a lot of the young people being unemployed. It is a matter of skill sets being mismatched and misallocation of jobs. I don't think the labor shortage problem is as severe as what people think. I think we should focus on the number of headcounts we have on Earth, which will help solve a lot of these problems.
Well, I guess the answer from Chandran, if I were to answer for him, is who are the people who are using most of the consumption? So in any case, we have about 10, 15 minutes to round off, and I know we're kind of getting to a more difficult place, and I would appreciate all of you addressing that you are on the, you are the ship captain on the Titanic, and what are the assumptions we're making, because what we're asking all of us to do is to steer the ship in another direction? And how can you persuade all the passengers and the owners of the vessels that you really need to now steer when they're telling you, don't worry, this ain't ever going to sink? Not really. Andrew.
Of course, I don't have the answer to that question, but I think Chandra makes some very good points, which at the back of our minds we all sort of know are real issues, which is the aspirational goals of developing Asia, which is you're right, to mimic the developed world. And we have some Stanford graduates here; they're not just Harvard graduates as well. But I think we all have the same sort of intellectual challenge, which is we sort of know the path that the world is heading down, and the growth models, the developmental models, fundamentally are not sustainable. But I don't think any society, and certainly not any politician, is ready to stand up and articulate clearly that one needs a fundamental different model. And I'm not sure what that model is. It's a model that is not an incremental model from where we are today. So I think, Christine, the idea of let's consume a little bit less electricity in Hong Kong, and incentivize utilities for energy efficiency programs, etc. That really is rearranging the deck chairs in Asia generally, if you want to call it that. Because Hong Kong is not a big energy consumer. It's the challenge of developing China, developing Asia with its massive populations, relatively low consumption levels now, and the aspiration to be like the West. That's where the real challenge is.
Michael.
Yeah, I agree with what Andrew just said. I just wanted to comment on several of these things. First of all, I believe what I call values in education, this thing you were talking about, is terribly important for a number of reasons. One, it affects people's behavior. Then it indirectly affects corporate behavior. But the most important reason is that without it, you can't do what Tim was talking about. You can't go to a population that doesn't have a clue what the sustainability problems and propose a set of policies that they're supposed to support. It just doesn't work. So it's kind of the foundation, I think, for all of this. So I'm complete. This is a bit gratuitous, but when I got involved in the developing countries, there was a raging debate, and it's, about macro versus micro and bottom up versus top down. And, I finally blew a whistle and said, time out. How many people think that the central bank's competence isn't important, and how many people think entrepreneurship is unimportant? Why are we arguing about whether A or B is the silver bullet when they're clearly complements? And this is a clear example of that. We need A and B and C. We need values in education so the population understand. When the Fung Global Institute, and we need policies, that create the level playing field, and businesses don't have this sort of first mover disadvantage that you've already heard about. When the Fung Global Institute first started talking about this, Victor started talking about changing lifestyles. And I thought, what are you talking about? I'm an American, right? Lifestyles is wearing pink socks and stuff like that. And he meant we're going to have to adapt in the ways that you were all just talking about a minute ago over time. And we don't know how to do that. I mean, you're probably right, Andrew, that a politician can't stand up and say. So let me just make two comments about that. The lady who spoke about population is right, and it's a very hard problem. As far as I know, China is the only country that has taken the position that the population dynamics is a policy decision. In every other part of the world, if you try to intervene in that, you'll be intervening in things that people regard as the most basic rights. So as far as I'm concerned, we're going to have to figure out the solution to this problem without doing that. And there's catastrophic interventions in places like India and whatnot. So that's point one. Point two, I think, at least in China, because of the sheer numbers of people, and I'm not sure about India, people understand that you have to impose constraints on behavior to make life livable for the whole, right? In some sense, the adding up problem is taken seriously. In And so if you have to sort of have a one-child policy for a while, it's okay. I'm willing to bet that after people find that it takes 5 hours, in about 10 years from now to drive across Beijing, that when somebody says maybe we want to sort of restrict the kinds of vehicles, the amount you drive, what you pay when you cross a certain boundary, that people will say kind of yes. I may be wrong about that, but that's what I believe. The problem in America is that people view driving a 3,000-pound vehicle all by themselves, 50 miles to work and back, is a right. And so...
with cheap gasoline as well.
With cheap gasoline, yeah, is a right. So we've just got miles and miles to go. It's one of the reasons that I'm sort of cautiously optimistic about Asia, because I think that there's a sense in which when we, I don't want to go too long about this, but this is really at the very fundamental kind of part of this. In Asia, there is a willingness to redefine the boundary between areas of total personal free choice and constrained choice to make the social sort of whole thing work. In America and a good chunk of the West, but America is the extreme case, what is defined as the area of personal free choice is constitutional and viewed as permanent. So if it doesn't sort of work, it's a much bigger deal to move that boundary around. Much bigger deal. So I think we have our hands tied behind our back in a way that...
Many of our policymakers go to the wrong schools, come back, and they dare not speak in public forums because then they'll be shouted at, you must be a commie. I mean, this is, and look at how relentlessly the Western media punishes China every time it takes that interventionist mode, because the prevailing ideology is that, people are free, therefore they should be able to do everything. So in the US, you have the silly thing that everyone can carry a gun.
I think Michael agrees with you. Michael, you're just going to have to move
this
over
we have
here
to change.
and be based in Hong Kong permanently.
No, I have this authoritarian
My last
streak.
thing, can we have the Fung Global Institute launching 1,000 PhDs in Asia that Victor Fung would fund around just this simple premise? No, 1,000 PhDs, because our rich and wealthy put money in Princeton's, Harvard's, Cambridge. 1,000 PhDs in universities that say, if 21st century is resource constrained, what will governments look like? What will prosperity look like? Because it's access to resources that creates prosperity. Therefore, how do we redefine rights? Rights not around, you have a right to just demonstrate at Tiananmen Square. What does rights look like? That should be, today you can't find a single PhD on the subject. How to hide $1 billion on a balance sheet? You'll find many.
Andy?
Yeah, I'm not sure I have all that much to add. I would just kind of, just listening to the conversation, I think this educational element is really quite important. And I just think about it, again, sort of quite basic and down to earth. I mean, I look at my own kids and the conversations that we have, I think it's very different from the conversations that I had with my older generation. Some of the topics that are being introduced it is just different. So it just kind of makes me think that, this is very important. I think all of what we talked about today, these are the types of issues that from an educational perspective, we need to really start pushing this forward. And I would just comment that, again, back to the business side, we have customers, and certainly we're starting to have employees who I think ask these questions. I would say we heard more from customers prior to the 2009 downturn. It seemed like after the 2009, the focus kind of shifted away. But prior to that, we have to do these bids all the time. These big companies say, transportation budgets, and so we go for the bid, and we were getting more and more of these, please also fill out this additional stack of paper. What are your sustainability credentials? What kind of fuel do you burn, et cetera, et cetera. So I think as the educational angle is pushed out more, probably from the customer base, for business, from a customer base and from an employee from a hiring perspective, that will also become more important, and hopefully that highlights the issue more and more, and helps to, I mean, I don't know what the solution is, but there needs to be a better balance somehow between all the aspirations and then, you know, what business. I agree with what Chandra's saying. Business is really, it's about doing more. So it's difficult to find that balance, but I think the educational element is very important.
Yeah.
Well, back to your point about less means more. You're talking about probably the government not really acknowledging that. I think this kind of idea is not hard to acknowledge by the government on all levels and by the business. You know, we know less means more and this particular circumstances, and we know. Well, we learned small is beautiful many years ago, decades ago. But the thing is, when these kind of values meet realities, the economic and political reality, these kind of value often fail, often, you know, to lose ground. You know, as customers, the lifestyles, human behavior, of course, this is very important. When I come to Hong Kong, friends remind me, you know, just bring more warm clothes, right? I mean, I come from Beijing, where it's 1,000 miles north in latitudes of Hong Kong. Here you find it, the room temperature is tuned below 20 degrees centigrade. I mean, we are consumers. We love this, right? Or we don't. I know, but I mean, this is Bob Rich's argument. Consumers bear responsibility there. But the thing is, the consumers also are the weak. When you compare it to the greater power in the consumption field, in the supply side, talking about the supply chain, you know, how much, I mean, Chandra talking about the buy one, get one free, how many of us can resist to that? So I think there need a fundamental change in thinking, and also there need a fundamental change in the rules that governs the rule that govern, you know, everything that we live in right now. Yeah, otherwise, yeah, a lot of people look into China for the population control and restrictions on cars. But the thing is, when you look at the population control, China has been very successful. But China has been and will continue to be the victim of this very policy, right? It did great for the entire world and do some real good things for China. But every economist knows, you know, one of the very important key factor for the economic success in the last three and a half decades, simply because the labor supply. Right? And China will definitely lose ground to India in that regard for the next 3 decades to come. I mean, that's the economic hard reality we have to think about. And China is actually the double victim, right? When that population policy was put there, and China for decades been criticized for doing so. So I think we are facing the world that is really, I mean, this hard reality politically and economically, and those rules need to be thought through and to deal with. Right.
Well, we have come to the end, but I see Pamela Mar's hand up, so I must give her the floor before I round up.
Yeah, I'm somewhat sorry that Chandran has left the room because I would actually like to put some perspective on his position that actually we need to sort of reverse consumption and stop the process of industrialization. So unfortunately, a lot of times radical positions are very attractive, and I think we need to get some perspective on it. My perspective is that actually the process of industrialization and shipping goods around the world and making consumer products, many of which I admit are rather useless. But the thing is, this process has produced useful things that people need to live. And the process has also, in doing so, created jobs And everyone talks about Asia's huge leap, in bringing 200, 300 million people out of poverty in the past 2 decades. How did that take place? It took place through industrialization. So we need to actually get a fair perspective on what this process has brought us. And now we say, okay, so today we have a new set of problems. So the thing is, we don't throw the whole model out. We actually look at it, how do we get a new framework of analysis which actually balances the social benefits which the system has produced and remains within our known environmental constraints while still providing the framework, the economic framework, which allows business to continue to innovate and continue to produce things that actually people need. So, I mean, that is the aim of the project that we've started at the Fung Global Institute. So if you've got answers, we'd love to hear them.
Well, I'd just like to share with you what I've taken personally away from this discussion. China being Chinese, China being part of Asia, being Asian, I think we accept the responsibility that we can do better. And we see that actually the Chinese thinking leadership is trying very hard to burst out of certain accepted constraints, but it's not easy. So I think perhaps one commitment that we can make is that we will continue on this path and do what we can. In terms of Hong Kong itself, what is it that we can do? We are the richest city, the most developed, best educated city in China. And I don't think in Hong Kong we've tried hard enough to identify a role for ourselves. Are we being too soft on ourselves by, again, just accepting the status quo? At least intellectually, if we are prepared to push ourselves, we have the capability in Asia, in Hong Kong, to be able to think this through. So I very much welcome the establishment of the Fung Global Institute and, of course, others in Hong Kong. Thirdly is the issue about technology. As Andrew reminded us, we already have the technology today to do many, many, many things. And I think we all know this. But the real question, and we're always struggling with this, is why are we not able to deploy these technologies, or why aren't we even able to do really, really simple things? And I think what I find comfort in with Andy's example of the Fair Winds Charter is, it's what I call low-tech technology. It's a social technology. All it did was to spend a period of time to bring the people who need to act to be together in a room, to provide some perspective so that they can share their experience. So that over a period of time, that the people who need to act together with government, who then came along, because they saw that the industry was willing to act, they thought they better be there. So they edge each other on, finally coming to an agreement, very simple agreement, something that they can all do. No technology is involved. When they sail into Hong Kong, they switch to a cleaner fuel. They can work out how much it costs, and actually with other types of calculation, we can now define through maps where the benefits are, who are the people living in which part of Hong Kong that will benefit from lower air pollution, and we can calculate the public health benefits. And by doing that, it inspired the government today in Shenzhen to say, we want to do this. And then Guangdong is now thinking about it, and Beijing is open-minded, because what it means in perhaps 2 or 3 years, there's a possibility of not only the Pearl River Delta ports declaring a low emission zone, but all the ports in China. So that's how fast we can move. You can, and there's a cost involved. It's actually relatively easy to do. So that kind of low-tech, very conscious, bringing people together, the people who are going to act, can be done. So can we do more of that? Can the Fung Global Institute help to bring the business community together to find other examples of the Fair Winds Charter type of public-private sector collaboration? So we're not talking about some completely different new technology and rolling it out. Just let's do what it is that we can. And the last point I want to make, it's about families. About 10 or 15 years ago, the rhetoric around the world was Asian companies dominated by families, by and large corrupt and bad. Today, I find that the rhetoric has turned. Because we're talking about values, because we're talking about change, suddenly people are looking at Asian family-held companies and saying, you have a higher chance of doing this. You don't have to look just as quarterly reporting. Can you be the change? So in a way, I find the issue in the last 15 years has come back full circle. Asia, you're it, you got to do it. Secondly is Asian companies, Asians, you got to contribute more. And I think the only thing I want to say at the end is, I really don't want the developed economies to get away so easily. I don't want them to say, because you're the big consumer, you're going to be doing all this, you got to practice better values, that we let them off the hook, that they're not going to do it. And this is perhaps also part of the conundrum, the part of the difficulty on the international stage global discussion. Because I think China is sort of saying that, look, I'm doing what I can. US, Europe, you got to do more. So in a way, that's frozen everybody and perhaps not being able to do anything. But I think perhaps as Asians or people who are not ethnically Asians but feel Asians living in Asia, let's just accept the responsibility that we're going to take this on big time. And I still think, Andrew, I want us not to think that if we were going to give you more money for reducing energy consumption, you don't think this is moving the chairs on the Titanic, in that Hong Kong is too small and it doesn't matter. So thank you very much, and thank you for being so collaborative and patient.
谢谢。